if I were to tell you that a Christian-led country invaded a predominantly Muslim country and Muslim-led country, a country that was supposedly harboring elements of Al Qaeda that would not respond to United States demands, and this country was supposedly harboring or did harbor a lot of oil and a lot of reserves, and this country was located in the Middle East, you would probably all assume that I was referring to Iraq. And some of you might say Afghanistan, even though it's technically not part of the Middle East, but the scenarios are very similar. But I would actually be making reference to the United States-backed invasion of Somalia by Ethiopia in December of 2006 and the subsequent occupation that continues on to this day. I would want everyone to be aware right off the top that Somalia has not been a very good country for quite some time. Part in its problems stem from a coup in the late 60s that overthrew Somalia at that point, that overthrew the Somalian democratically elected government at that point. At that point, Somalia was the oldest democracy on the continent of Africa. It would later invade Ethiopia in the late 70s, a United States-backed invasion. It got more military aid in the 80s than any other country in Africa, and of course we all know that it became the first modern state to not have a government in 1991. So it's started off from there. For 16 years, the nation of Somalia had no effective functioning government. And we all know, for the most part, we would associate Somalia with the infamous Black Hawk Down story, that in which several Marines were killed along with a Malaysian commando. But there's a lot more to it than that, and we'll go ahead and I will start with a basic little timeline and get into things. But one of the primary backdrops behind the invasion of Somalia perhaps is oil, although there's differing reports on how much oil is actually there, but there's definitely some there. And as early as 1990, it was known as the last government of Somalia before the Union of Islamic Courts was able to consolidate power in Mogadishu and the surrounding areas in 2006. Well, this government was still in power in 1990 and entered into an oil deal for explorations, etc., with Conoco, Amoco, Chevron, and Phillips. Of course, the deal never could be consummated because the dictator was overthrown. Siad Barre, Siadbarre, I can't pronounce it, I apologize. He was overthrown, and so the country became, very unsafe. And then there was the use of food as a weapon, which is the ostensibility for President Bush inserting the troops during Operation Restore Hope. Incidentally, just as a side note, the Marines utilized Conoco's headquarters there as their headquarters, their office, because the embassy had been shelled and destroyed. Conoco's Somalian manager would get a letter of thanks from the Marine Corps, the general in charge of the Marine General Frank Labudi, I see here. But we all know how that ended. Everybody left Somalia, and then the warlords who were running things at the time, continued to run things for quite some time, and Somalia was described as in a state of anarchy. Well, that's really not true as far as anarchism goes. If we really look at it, and I'm not going to explain to you the tenets of anarchy here, but if we really look at what a government is and what a government does, the problem isn't that there was no government in Somalia. The problem is there was too much government. There were clan governments that had territorial jurisdiction over who came in, who went out, who did what, when they did it, what could happen, and it would be completely different from one block to the next. 3 streets over, there would be completely different rules. So it's not that there was too much, too little regulation. There was too many people in charge. Well, in 2001, people finally started forming a government in Somalia, a transitional government that promptly signed an oil deal with a French oil company. In August of 2004, this parliament was elected. It chose Abdullah Yusuf for president. He's a former head of the autonomous Somalian state of Puntland, Puntland. And I'm not really sure. I tried to look for information, couldn't find much about how this parliament came to be, how a lawless, veritable stateless society ran by warlords. I don't recall exactly how democratic the election of this parliament was, but there are some things about Yusuf that I'd like to talk about at the moment. Yusuf has been associated by the United States State Department as being associated with militias that have used extrajudicial killings in order to further their own political agendas. There's no reports that he was involved personally in these killings, but excuse me, he was certainly associated with these militias. And also, since becoming prime minister, he has called for people to rise up and help stamp out the opposition. And he describes the opposition, along with the president, as genealogical clan groups, as opposed to just, the opposition being political or even, genuinely terrorist. He said it would essentially be akin to someone here coming out and saying, we have to deal with the opposition in any way we see fit. And the opposition is African Americans or something like that, because that's, it's a very frightening terminology that's quite reminiscent of every fascist regime you could possibly think of. Well, in 2005, the transitional government moved to Mogadishu, and by late 2005, they had to flee to Kenya because they had absolutely no control, no respect, and no power, and could not do anything because the warlords refused to respect them. And also, Yusuf was seen primarily as a pawn of the Ethiopian government, and Ethiopia and Somalia, and we'll get to Ethiopia's involvement later, but historically have a lot of tense rivalries over colonial splits, where part of what's traditionally considered Somalia was put into Ethiopia. There's some other things that I'm not going to get into here, but there's, to be seen as a pawn of the Ethiopians would be terribly detrimental to any leader of Somalia. Well, in 2006, the Union of Islamic Courts, which was a system of courts, independent courts that had started rising up in opposition to the constant disorder and chaos that was permeating Mogadishu and the surrounding areas of Somalia, where they would engage in Sharia law, which is Islamic law, mixed with clan law, which is something that's very important in Somalia as well, to kind of restore a semblance of order. And they came up with a union and formed militias and started to beat back the warlords and bring about a semblance of order in the city of Mogadishu. Granted, there are certain reports, and these reports are most likely they are true, that they did repress freedom, they did repress women's freedom of movement, they did stop cinemas from showing Western movies. They also refused to allow genders to mix for celebratory purposes. But overall, the people of Mogadishu and Somalia were happy because the lawlessness had been abated. You have to understand, 16 years of effective statelessness and wanton violence and chaos would lead people to make a few concessions at first to of these elements so that they could be safer. In fact, even the UN, as late as in December 2007, came out and said things were better in Somalia from a humanitarian perspective when the UIC, the Union of Islamic Courts, were in power. There's like a schism at some point around here right after they take Mogadishu, the Union of Islamic Courts. They changed their name to the, I believe, the Council of Islamic Courts, but I refer to them as the UIC throughout this for those purposes. But there is an internal schism. Another thing I want to talk about with the Sharia law is part of it is this is an alliance of different courts. Some were more extreme than others. One of the people in charge, the primary person in charge, I think, after the schism, is on a list from the CIA who wanted for being connected to Al Qaeda. There's no getting around that. It's certainly true. There's I don't know the proof or evidence that he is connected with them, but they is wanted for questioning. They did take over, and they took over from from the warlords, and the warlords got together and were actually backed by the CIA and were with weapons, and they were also backed with money. And there were reports where people say, the warlords supposedly told Mogadishu citizens that blatantly that's where they were getting their money. The New York Times and various other reports also talked about this after the fact. It's called the Alliance for the Restoration of Peace and Counterterrorism, which is a very Orwellian name for a bunch of warlords who had been running the country and had set up the sectarian differences and the territorial differences I described earlier that were causing the chaos. Well, they were defeated. The transitional federal government had now set up shop in Badoa, a place I think it's about 30 kilometers away from Mogadishu, the capital of Somalia. And they had asked Ethiopia for support to ostensibly keep the Islamists from taking over and bringing about absolute chaos or what have you. And we'll get into what happens next in part 2.